sorry, let's now move on with the second speaker of the session, Corentin Durand. Corentin Durand is researcher at the University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, and his presentation's called You Can't Say That in Here, From Communication Spaces to Moral Economy in Prisons. So Corentin, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you, David. Can you all hear me? This is good?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, cool. So thank you, David, and thank you to all the organizer and presenter of this great conference. So the role of communication in maintaining prison order has long been established, from the early US prison ethnographies to the revival of prison research in the early 90s, both in France and United Kingdom. Since then, numerous studies have reinforced and refined the claim that everyday communication are instrumental in shaping power relations between prisoners and staff. Yet prison communication have also undergone significant change over the years, notably under the influence of the fear of legal challenges and the implementation of new management strategies. These changing practices affect the very nature of power in prison, as well as the experiences of both prisoners and staff. In this paper, I argue that a proper understanding of contemporary prison power needs to address the multiplicity and mobility of prison communication in its various spaces. The passageways where prisoners and frontline officers exchange on a regular basis, the circulation of written requests sent by prisoners to senior officers, the face-to-face hearings that one prisoners and one senior officers where they can discuss grievances, or finally, the disciplinary hearings where the communications are polarized by the almost certainty of punishment. In this talk, I want to introduce the notion of communication space in order to analyze how spaces shape communications practices and in turn redefine the power relations between prisoners and staff. So first, let me give you an outline of my talk. After presenting some data, I will turn to three successive questions. First, how do meaningful communications between prisoners and staff take place? Second, how do different communication spaces affect the nature of relation they are building? Third, how do these spaces interact with each other, and what can tell us about the transformation of power relations in prison? Okay, so first, my presentation is based on ethnographies I conducted in two French prisons. The first one was Marigny Prison, an old one, publicly run medium security prison, incarcerating around 300 long-term prisoners. The second one on the right was a newly constructed semi-private jail, imprisoning around 700 pre-trial detainees and short-term convicts. In both facilities, the fieldwork combined semi-structural and informal interviews with both prisoners and staff, as well as direct observations of interaction between them and analysis of large bodies of written communication between them. So my first question is, where do meaningful communication between prisoners and staff take place? By meaningful, I mean communication that prisoners and all staff identify as instrumental in shaping a relation with the other side. My research ended up in identifying four major communication spaces. There were others, of course, but those four were mentioned the most by both prisoners and staff, each of them with distinctive settings to negotiate power relations. So the first one is passageways. It's most studies on prison communication that dealt with interaction between prisoners and frontline officers, focusing on places like corridors, cells, or passageways. They are indeed the bedrock of prison order. Frontline officers are the first and often the only representatives of prison administration that prisoner gets to talk to on a daily basis. Their communications are shaped by strong interdependency, and in that context, informal relations and negotiations are critical to navigate the uncertainties of prison life. Yet frontline officers have been gradually stripped away of most, if not all, their formal discretionary power. As a result, prisoners must now reach senior officers and managers to ask for anything substantial, such as moving to a different cell, being enrolled in an activity, or ordering items not on the prison catalog. All of this is mostly done through written grievances. Sorry about that slide, it's a bit... Indeed, the second communication space prisoners talk about the most is the circulation of written grievances sent to senior officers. Written grievancing break through the discontinuities of prisons to reach distant offices without any need for physical presence. A woman I met in a re-entry shelter explained that, quote, "You always told write a letter. For everything, you need to write a letter, for everything. Even to know how much money you have left, you have to write a note and give it to the guard, for everything." The list went on and on for quite a while and was echoed in numerous interviews. This increasing importance of written communication has been supported by policies designed to foster the professionalization of staff and to discipline the expression of prisoners. As of now, written grievances are plenty present. In 1 month, in Tourmail jail, where, as I said, about 700 prisoners are incarcerated, a little more than 1,400 letters were recorded in the management software, not including all of those that were lost or dealt with without any formal registration. They were either on separate sheets of paper or, as the administration would have it, on specific forms. Yet these letters receive very few answers, and experienced prisoners tend to avoid sending them and try to obtain face-to-face meetings with senior officials. Face-to-face hearings are far less frequent and often target prisoners considered as problematic. They are brief, behind closed doors meetings between one prisoner and one, sometimes two, senior officers. They allow for a direct negotiation of substantial decision regarding prison life. Contrary to frontline officers, senior managers hold actual discretionary power over the fate of prisoners, and they are fully aware of this relational dimension of face-to-face hearings. One deputy warden told me that most of the time he could have dealt with the request without seeing the person, but quote, "just having contact with authority is important." Indeed, face-to-face hearing aim at creating and maintaining cooperative and personal relations where benevolence comes in exchange of smooth cooperation. Lastly, the contemporary disciplinary hearings, in France at least, are the result of a long process of legalization and formalization prompted by the French administrative court's decision to accept appeals from punished prisoners. Hearings take place in a dedicated room located in the disciplinary segregation unit. They meet under the authority of the warden, assisted by one officer and representative of civil society. The prisoners is also allowed to have an attorney present. Finally, there are at least 2 guards that are present in case of a violent outburst. Everyone's statements are partially transcribed and included in the final decision, which is in turn sent to various judicial and administrative authorities. So with these 4 spaces in mind, I can turn to my second question, which is, how do different communication spaces affect the nature of the relations prisoner and staff built? It soon became clear to me that when prisoners and staff talked about written communications or disciplinary hearings, they did not only describe physical spaces. Entering a communication space meant assuming specific statuses and abiding with specific communicative norm. I witnessed that from one space to another, the same people would use formal or informal pronouns. They would have a tendency to underline cooperation or conflict, or they would ban or accept the use of legal references. As a result, my use of the notion of communication space does not only refer to a physical space, it is an assemblage of various dimensions. To give a working definition, communication space is the norm discursive space shaped by messages, mostly discourses, set in a spatial and material setting according to stabilized participation statuses. I don't want to spend too much time on the notion itself, but I'd be happy to send a more theoretical paper to anyone interested. What I want to do is more focus on what the notion tries to accomplish, which is to describe the various dynamics of prison communication and relation building. To do so, I think that the spatial metaphor can be very useful to identify key characteristics. Among those, I want to focus on distance and porosity. It should be noted right away that one feature do not determine the nature of the content of a communication space. It simply offers specific constraints and opportunities to social actors within it. That being said, let's examine distance. So Max Weber famously noted that a key feature of bureaucracy is the depersonalization of relations. Indeed, the physical distance of written communication makes prisoners unsure of who is reading their requests. As a result, grievances letters I analyzed were quite impersonal in the way of addressing prison officials, especially when you compare them with imprisoned spaces where signs of personalization play a critical role. It is also frequent to read prisoners mentioning that they have already sent similar letters numerous times and wonder if anyone is reading them. Distance fosters a kind of invisibility and indifferentiation in the representation of the prison administration. Even within in-person communications, the physical distance can shape the way participants address each other. In disciplinary hearings, prisoners must stand on a designated spot, and guards make sure that they don't go near the disciplinary board. It allows for stronger language from the prison management, as one deputy warden once explained to me. She had just had a face-to-face hearing with a prisoner that she considered out of line, but she refrained to confront him, waiting for an upcoming disciplinary hearing. She explained, "In disciplinary hearings, I'm in a position of domination." Well, yes, domination. Officers are present. Being able, end of quote, being able to keep people at a distance also means that you don't have to take their immediate reactions into account as much. You can be more confrontational. So second, I want to turn to porosity, which is the answer to a question how permeable to other space is the communication space. Porosity can come from, sure. Porosity can come from the presence of third parties. It is striking to observe that the same people interacting in prison passageways where prison and staff can always see and hear the communication, and when they are behind the closed door of an office. Formal pronouns can turn to informal ones mid-sentence. The absence of an audience makes it possible to go beyond oppositional statuses to express empathy, to share confidential informations, or to engage in informal transactions. On the opposite, the presence of a civil society assessor and an attorney makes such communications more than frowned upon in the framework of disciplinary hearings. Porosity can also come from archiving practices, which are more and more common in prison and a way to prevent legal risk and assess work performances. Archives redefine the limits and participants of communication space. I remember seeing a prisoner pause during a face-to-face hearing when he noticed that the senior officer had started typing down what he was saying. He said, "You're not writing this, I hope. It's my life. I have no secrets for you, but that's it." Porosity directly challenges the very nature of what prisoners consider to be a personal and confidential communication, and the senior officer had to reassure him that he was not putting any intimate information into the software before the conversation could start again. So this is by no way a systematic examination of all the differences between communication spaces. Yet difference, access, and porosity help us understand how spatial features can shape quite different, if not opposite, forms of discourses, power relations, and experiences. That brings me to my final question, which is how do those communication spaces interact, and what can you tell us about the transformation of power relations in prison? The first way to think about this is in terms of to think about this mobility between communication spaces is in terms of a historical dynamic towards increased bureaucratization, distance, restricted access, and porosity. Such trends have been well documented in seminal studies by James Jacobs and Thomas Matheson, and more recently in Bedrew's work on neo-paternalism. Yet, even though it's obvious that bureaucratized communication are increasingly important in prison life, I argue that communication spaces are not historically exclusive. Informal, verbal, and interpersonal communication spaces are not relics of an outdated prison order, but they are part and parcel of the current one. Distance and proximity, porosity and impermeability shape the opposite and complementary faces of the expression of incarceration and the experience prison and staff have of the prison. As such, they need to be studied as a system. Describing the moral economy of prison life involves thinking about circulations and tensions and adjustments between communication spaces. Prisoners and staff are fully aware of the constraints and resources produced by the coexistence of these widely different spaces. Senior officers, for instance, spend most of their day weighing up pros and cons about of various communication spaces in order to build, maintain, and correct effective relation with prisoners, whether by summoning a face-to-face meeting with the troublemaking prisoners to make sure that he knows that management has its best interest at heart, or not responding to numerous grievances by one prisoner to reassert control over the communication, or even dealing with an incident in a disciplinary setting to underline the structural asymmetry of the relation. As a result, people circle in between communication space, shaping the unique experience of prison parallel relations. So by combining discursive and spatial terms in prison studies, I think it makes possible to analyze how communication space shape those discourses and, as a consequence, transform the nature of power relations between prison and staff. Analyzed together, they form a hybrid moral economy, mixing distant and close, public and confidential, informal and bureaucratic, cooperative and agonistic. That moral economy could be characterized after Gresham Sykes as a custodial bureaucracy. Bureaucracy because it's obvious that written communication, distance, formal norms have taken up increasing importance in prison. Custodial because that bureaucratization is endlessly challenged by informal practices and interpersonal communication rendered necessary by the structural conflict and asymmetry of prison life. Thank you.
Thank you, Corentin, for this dense presentation on the complex links between communication and prison management or prison's governance. I found it very interesting. So the time it takes for the questions to reach my screen, I have a question myself. You may not be informed, but in Belgium, a right of complaint has just been put in place in an effective way. So prisoners thus have the right to submit written complaints against a direction's decision, and an independent commission will decide to keep, to transfer, or to cancel the decision. So this is very recent. and it means that there is a new channel of written communication, and then also oral communication, because there is a mini court, a mini tribunal. And my question is simple. It's an old question and almost a banal question when we talk about the rights of prisoners. How do these openings of spaces for speaking or writing fit into the tension between promoting prisoners' rights and legitimizing prison domination? Or to ask the question differently, how does allowing prisoners to speak legitimize imprisonment?
Thank you. It's a great question. I didn't know. I heard about it, but I didn't know it was in place. Independent commission reviewing complaints. It's indeed one of many new communication space where in France, the US, the UK, Belgium, etc., have been created for prisoners to express and have their grievances dealt with by either independent or administrative bodies or even judicial bodies. I think this historical movement, which is, I think, one of the defining movement of the current trend in prisons, must be analyzed as a response, a way of for the administration to incorporate criticism from the outside. If you look at the history of the claim for prisoners to be able to voice criticism, from Foucault to Black Panthers in the US to I mean every country have a different history, but pretty similar in the way in the 60s, 70s there were riots outside social movements, etc., claiming the right to voice grievances. And those spaces with notable differences, and I hope that the talk made it clear that those differences are very instrumental in the way they shape prison relations, are a way to incorporate into the normal functioning of the prisons, new rights, new actors, etc., etc. So that dynamic of how the prison incorporates a densified normative environment is definitely at the core of my analysis of the history of communication space in opening of new ones.
Okay, thank you. A question from Christophe Mack, who thanks you for the quality of the presentation. Do you see a link with the specific characteristic of some other communication spaces, such as social networks or comments under online publication? He adds, I think about the lack of interaction, which allows to be more confrontational.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely. I think, I mean, this presentation is part of a more general theoretical project about trying to identify characteristics that would be helpful to describe any, well, maybe not any, but communication space outside of prison. And one of that characteristic that I didn't have time to talk here is the exclusivity of the communication space, whereas there is or there isn't movement between several communication space for the same people. If senior officers had no way of meeting the prisoners in their cell, in the corridors, in the passageways, and they were distant, as in, for instance, Calavita and Janus analysis of prison grievances in California, where people handling prison grievances are in faraway offices, a few hundred miles from the prison. They don't have to take into account how they're going to react. They don't have to take into account the long-term relation they are building when they don't answer, when they answer like denied, and that's it. So definitely the kind of exclusivity, and I think, and definitely to find those characteristics, I thought of other communication spaces outside of prison, for sure.
Thank you. One last question of Nora Spicer. Nora Spicer used the word post in French, poster, in her work to express the consideration of distance as a special effect of prison communication. And she asked, do you have thought on this word post in relation to your work, or other keywords within this overlapping concept? Corentin,
Okay,
you are
yeah,
muted.
sorry. Yeah, I'm back. I was actually saying that I was going to have a look at the written question, because I'm not sure I fully understand the I mean, to go in the very etymological post in terms of circulation of mail. I think it's an interesting way of thinking of communication spaces behind the core presence of interlocutors. But I'm not sure that's the question. Maybe we can talk about with Nora on the chat rooms to get that straight.
Okay. Thank you. Time flies, so I suggest you continue the conversation in the coffee